Welcome everyone. I'm Marianne Cosgrove, Acting Chair of Humanists Australia. Today is Activism Day, the final day of Launchapalooza, a series of events celebrating the launch of Humanists Australia. Before we begin this session, I wish to acknowledge that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land and that sovereignty was never ceded. I wish to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here today. I recognise your continuing connection to culture and country. I will listen to your stories and try to understand your lived experiences. I will speak up when I see you suffering from injustice. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be made available to the public through the Humanist Australia YouTube channel and other media. Please keep your video camera off if you're concerned for your privacy. Lyndon Storey is the author of Humanity or Sovereignty and has been an active humanist for many years. He was the founding convener of the ACT Humanist Society, is a former president of the Council of Australian Humanist Societies, has been a volunteer humanist chaplain, and has written extensively about humanism. He's interested in exploring how humanism can underpin a way of life. Today, Lyndon will speak about activism through the Human Union Project and campaign platform. Please welcome my friend and humanist mentor, Lyndon Storey.
Thanks very much, Marianne, and thank you everybody for that warm welcome. I'm going to start by checking, can everybody hear me clearly?
Yes, thank you, Lyndon.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of activism the Australian humanist movement has engaged in the past, and a bit more about what I think the Australian humanist movement should be focusing on today. I also plan to leave quite a bit of time for discussion at the end. Activism by its very nature is something which involves people doing things, so I think it's important to try to get people involved in discussion. I'll be making the case that humanism offers a powerful framework for looking at life, and that we as humanists need to be active in campaigning to support humanist values and to make the world a better place for all human beings and other living creatures. Broad-ranging political and social activism to build a better world should be a key activity for any organisation which claims to represent humanism. Having said that, I probably should explain what I mean by the term humanism. There's many competing views and interpretations of this word, and I do not want to take a long time talking about what I mean by humanism, especially with this audience, which I think is fairly well informed as to what humanism means. But I will take a few moments to sketch out what I would see of humanism as a worldview. And to do that, I've prepared a couple of slides. So I'm going to ask you to bear with me while I see if I can share a screen. And then actually get the presentation.
Yes, we can see that, Lyndon.
Great, thanks for that, Marianne. Now, I've got bits of Zoom obscuring the... Hopefully I've...
Yes, we can see your full screen slides now, thank you.
Okay, excellent, thanks. Thanks for that. A worldview is an orientation or outlook that provides a basic explanation of how the world works and a basic justification of actions and ethical decisions in that world. It need not be a fully worked out precise philosophy, and it need not offer an explanation for everything, just enough of an orientation to help an individual navigate through life. To explain this, I prepared a slide with a sort of minimalist model of a worldview. A worldview should provide an explanation of at least four things: how the world works, the basis of ethics and morals, how to be a better person, and a vision or goal for the future. For example, Christianity offers God's actions as the explanation of one. The world works as God intends it to. For part two, it offers the commands of God. God commands the rules of morality and commands that we obey them. For part 3, it offers that the answer that allowing oneself to be guided by God is the way to be a better person. For 4, the answer is not so clear. In a secular sense, I assume it will be a world where everyone is a Christian. Alternatively, it might mean getting into heaven. While there are many differences amongst Christians, the broad worldview will be quite similar across different denominations and groups. To give another brief example, the worldview of a dedicated free marketeer would see, for point 1, the explanation of the world as it is today as being due to the interaction of the workings of the free market with the actions of those who try to stop it, such as those who support progressive taxation and welfare payments. The grounds of ethical action would be the free market, market-based decisions being good, while non-market decisions are seen as bad. For 3, the path to being a better person is simply to act as rationally as possible in the pursuit of one's own self-interest. And the goal pursuant to 4 would be a world where everything was decided by the free market. I stress I am not advocating either of these worldviews. I'm simply using the ideologies concerned to show how they can offer people a worldview which can be shared even when the believers disagree on precise matters of religious or economic doctrine, and to show how a worldview can offer a simple basic framework which can inspire and guide people through life and help them make decisions in a variety of circumstances. Can we generate a humanist-inspired worldview? Is humanism just a rejection of religion combined with a claim that people can be ethical, or does it offer enough for people to develop a workable worldview? I believe it easily offers enough to generate a workable worldview. A worldview which I, for one, find far more persuasive than religious or free market worldviews. What are the elements of a humanist worldview? Now, I tried to put this onto one single slide, but I think the eyes viewing the world might have obscured a bit of it, but I hope that's mostly clear to people, and I'll just briefly explain what I've up there. For one, the explanation of the world, science is the clear guide to explaining the world for humanists, I should say. Although I would also add on empirically testable ideas and reason for those fields of knowledge, for instance, history and law, which have not proven capable of being developed as sciences. For 2, the grounds of ethics, it's clear that a humanist worldview strongly relies on sympathy and compassion, or more broadly, our social sense and social potentials as the fundamental drivers of ethical behaviour. These, when backed by education and extended and modified by reason, offer a framework for ethics and ethical conduct. Humanist thinkers as diverse as David Hume, Mencius and Charles Darwin have all offered variations on this theme. For 3, how to become a better person, the humanist answer is that this source is inherent within us. The humanist worldview asks us for self-actualisation, the realise of the best in our individual potential. Self-actualisation was famously advocated by humanist psychologists such as Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. They popularised that term. You can call it self-realisation or fulfilment. It doesn't have to be called self-actualisation. The humanist version of self-actualisation does include our social and ethical potential, as noted in 2. So humanist self-actualisation needs to be distinguished from a sort of selfish, individualistic version of the same concept. Humanism, though, definitely does offer a vision of how to become a better person and to be inspired to be a better person. For 4, humanism does indeed offer a vision for the future, a vision of a world where all human beings have the opportunity to realise their best potential. As humanist ethics are based on sympathy and compassion, and as we realise we can extend this beyond humans to others, this final goal should also include a better relationship with non-human animals as well. And in this sense, the humanist vision extends way beyond human beings. I could cite all sorts of people for examples of this type of thinking, and I don't want to use up too much time, but I've picked one person whose thought crosses most of those four elements, Charles Darwin. I'll just give a few quotes from Charles Darwin writing in The Descent of Man. He wrote, "Any animal whatever endowed with well-marked social instincts would inevitably acquire a moral sense or conscience as soon as its intellectual powers had become as well developed or nearly as well developed as in man. Notwithstanding many sources of doubt, man can generally and readily distinguish between the higher and lower moral rules. As man advances in civilization and small tribes are united into larger communities, the simplest reason would tell each individual that he ought to extend his social instincts and sympathies to all the members of the same nation, though personally unknown to him. This point being once reached, there is only an artificial barrier to prevent his sympathies extending to the men of all nations and races. Sympathy beyond the confines of man, that is, humanity to the lower animals, seems to be one of the latest moral acquisitions. This virtue, one of the noblest with which man is endowed, seems to arise incidentally from our sympathies becoming more tender and more widely diffused until they are extended to all sentient beings." So if you listen to that quote, Darwin is offering a framework of ethics based on sympathy and compassion. He generally prefers to call that the moral sense, but that's like a bit of reason applied to sympathy and compassion. He sees that as a way to build up an individual person, and he also sees that as eventually leading to a sort of global sense of sympathy extending to all sentient beings. And of course, he is trying to provide a scientific basis for all of this through his study of human evolution. So I throw out Darwin as one example of someone who expresses a humanist worldview through his actions and works. But this is the bit of the talk which I could extend for hours by going through various other people who do a similar thing, but I won't. Instead, I'm going to go straight on to the question of humanist activism. The humanist worldview offers a vision of a future with justice for all, for human and non-human, and a path for an individual to be a better person, realising their best potential and supporting the opportunities of others to lead fulfilling lives. Indeed, the very first sentence of the first clause of the Amsterdam Declaration states that humanism is ethical, and that clause goes on to say that humanists have a duty of care to all of humanity. A humanist worldview is not a quietist one. It does not focus solely on the individual or retreating from the world. It's an inescapably social one and cannot help but lead to an activist approach to political and social reform. In that case, one would expect the humanist movement to be an activist movement, and it has been that. The Australian humanist movement does have a long history of activism. Most of this, admittedly, occurred in the 1960s and 70s when membership was greater, and it was mostly focused on winding back the power of religion in society. Some of the key areas of focus included campaigning for changes to Australia's census question on religion so as to include an option for no religion. This particular change has meant that our national census reports a number for the non-religious in Australia and has been a big part of people having a sense of Australia progressively becoming a more and more secularist society. And I've talked about this in the past. Some of the older humanists in the audience have actually piped up and told me about some of the humanist activists who played a very big role in this census change. I myself don't know all those details, and I don't know if we have anybody in this group who remembers that process, but it was a big part of humanist activism in Australia in the past. Opposing government funding of religious schools was another key humanist campaign, and as we all know, that's a campaign that's yet to succeed. There are other campaigns in terms of supporting abortion rights, supporting the right to die with dignity, a campaign that is still going strongly and having successes in parts of Australia, and supporting equal rights for women, LGBTQI people, and other minority groups. And all these campaigns are still going with varying degrees of success. Now, in many of these campaigns in Australia, humanist activists provided a strong early stimulus, but the humanist contribution has steadily declined. Many such campaigns are now pursued mostly by groups focused on single issues in relation to those campaigns. It seems likely that one of the reasons for the decline in membership of the humanist movement in Australia has been people focusing on single issue campaigns rather than the broader humanist movement. The methods used, I need to talk about methods as well if I'm going to talk about activism. The methods used in the early days of humanist activism in Australia included writing letters to newspaper editors, getting articles in newspapers, making submissions to governments, and joining in street demonstrations with other like-minded groups. This period of humanist activism saw the humanist movement make a worthy contribution to social change in Australia. But worthy though it was, there are areas in which I believe it deserves criticism. So now here comes a slide with my criticisms. There's a number of points that can be made about that early stream of humanist activism in Australia. Firstly, by focusing so heavily on combating religion and religiously inspired social policies, this period of activism did little to promote the broader humanist worldview I was talking about before. The humanist commitment to build a better world for all appeared subsumed under the battle to combat religion. This focus also meant that humanism risked being seen as not so much an outlook underpinning a worldview in its own right, but not much more than a branch of the secularist movement. Many members of humanist societies are also members of atheist, rationalist and/or secularist groups. Several of the leaders of humanist societies also had leadership positions in other secularist groups. Now, I want to emphasise, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing in itself. There's an obvious, very large overlap of interests. But if we are talking about activism inspired by a humanist worldview, it has to be more than simply combating religion. It should be about building a world where everyone's dignity is respected and everyone has as full a chance as possible for self-realisation and building better relations with others, both with humans and non-humans. One of the big questions here is whether people take a subtraction story approach or build humanist values approach. By a subtraction story approach, I mean the idea that all we have to do is subtract religion and everything will be fine. I disagree with this view. The slow switch in Europe from religiously inspired armies killing and maiming many people to nationalism-inspired armies killing and maiming many people is just one, albeit ferocious, example of how building a better world is a more complex task than simply pushing back the influence of religion. I disagree, as I said before, with the subtraction approach. My own humanist worldview inspires me to try to work to build a better world. It opens my eyes to all sorts of injustices and problems in the world, to economic and political injustices, to global economic inequality, warfare, human rights violations, climate change, and a host of other issues, not only those caused by religion. And this humanist vision helps inspire me to try to work with others to address these problems. So I'm going to say that the traditional thrust of humanist activism in Australia while justifiable and worthy, hardly counts as actions inspired by a humanist worldview. In terms of the methods used, I could also say that a focus on traditional mainstream media is misguided now, but that was then, so it's hardly worth criticising people for relying on mainstream media 10 and 20 years ago. It's up to us to work out more appropriate means for the age we live in today. And talking of more appropriate means leads me to talk about the Human Union website. Of course, I've made these criticisms, but I'm not the only person who wants to broaden out the range of activism engaged in by the Australian humanist movement. And in fact, over the last few years especially, change has already started. The formation and growth of the new Humanist Australia organisation should support and accelerate this change. Even before the Humanist Australia process started, several of us had got together to set up a website inspired by a humanist worldview, which would campaign on a broad range of social justice issues that can be illumined by a humanist worldview. This website is called Human Union and will focus its campaigns in 5 key themes, which I've stuck up on the slide there. The key themes are promoting a global human union, living a meaningful and fulfilling life, seeking economic justice for all, defending human dignity and human rights, and caring for our environment. If you can, I'd ask you to go to the website at www.humanunion.org.au, while I'm talking about it today, and have a look around. The overarching theme of the website is that, inspired by a humanist worldview, we will campaign to build a global political system that respects the worth, dignity, and autonomy of every human being without exception or discrimination. Human Union supports the maximum possible opportunities for all human beings to flourish while maintaining a sustainable basis for humanity's relationship with the rest of nature and other life forms. In terms of its methods, the website has concentrated on supporting petitions and letter writing campaigns at this stage and connecting with other groups with similar goals on particular issues. But we are in our early days and hope to expand our range of activities as we acquire more skill and more people become involved with us. I will try to briefly explain the 5 themes, but leave more discussion for the discussion at the end of this talk. The first theme is probably the one that needs the most explanation: promoting a global human union. Sometimes a problem has been around so long that people see it as part of the nature of things rather than the problem that it truly is. For thousands of years, issues such as slavery and the subordination of women were not seen as problems, but just the way the world is. That is, if they are even noticed at all. Today, we still face some invisible problems. One of the most invisible is the division of the world into competing states. The system of competing states has hampered attempts to cooperate on climate change, economic inequality, poverty and starvation, global human rights protection, information sharing in relation to COVID-19, and numerous other issues. It has also blinded us to the terrible fact that every war is in fact a civil war of humanity. The best way to address this is to build a political system which transcends the world of competing states, not to deny the importance of our national identities, but to instantiate into our political systems another of our shared identities, our human identity. Of all the worldviews I know of, humanism is the one most naturally suited to seeing through the veil of nation and race, religion and ideology, to see the common humanity we all share and the need to build a political system to respect that. If we accept that we need to respect the basic dignity of all our fellow human beings, then we need to develop the social and political institutions that put that respect into practice. Our proposal to realise this is that we start forming a human union, an association of states that observe agreed upon common basic political standards in respect of democracy, human rights, environmental protection, and other areas that may be agreed upon by members. This does not have to start with all countries. It can start with one country declaring it is ready to negotiate to start building a human union with others and grow gradually from there. Likewise, a human union does not have to start with agreement on everything. It can start with agreement in a few areas and grow gradually. The human union process may take a long time, but one of the most important achievements we can make today is to actually start the human union process. To help visualise this, think of the European Union and cross out Europe and put in human instead. The European Union was unimaginable in the first half of the last century as Europe struggled through two terrible world wars based on supposedly irreconcilable difference and conflict between different groups in Europe. Today, the extraordinary change of Europe from a zone of perpetual war to one of peace, democracy, and human rights is not even seen as remarkable anymore, just as the way that Europe is. A human union can bring the same transformation to the world. We just need the vision to do that, the vision that can be provided by a humanist worldview. I'll now look at theme 2, living a meaningful and fulfilling life. The path to a life of human flourishing is based on cultivating and realising our best human potentials, such as love, compassion, sympathy, and reason. This is a humanist path and is based on realising our best potentials as human beings. As humanists, we believe that humans are a social species and that human fulfilment cannot be achieved in isolation. The Human Union website will support people to work either individually or in community groups to develop meaningful and fulfilling lives based on compassion and sympathy rather than greed and competition. The third theme is seeking economic justice for all. In our age, the increasing reduction of social life to questions of economic utility has created growing inequality. It has increased the precariousness of people's livelihoods and contributed to more and more unfulfilled lives as people become trapped on a hedonic treadmill. The wealthier and wealthier our societies become, the lonelier and more alienated and more unfulfilled more and more people appear to feel. Humanism's focus on the fulfillment and realisation of the best potentials in every human being offers an alternative framework of values to economic neoliberalism, a framework that justifies policies designed to support human welfare and fulfillment rather than, Humanism offers a framework that justifies policies designed to support human welfare and fulfillment rather than ever-increasing wealth maximisation coupled with inequality and unhappiness. The fourth theme is defending human dignity and human rights. This is the easiest theme to explain. We support building a world based on respect for the dignity and fulfillment of all people. This means we must support the human rights of all people everywhere. We oppose claims by any ideology or thought system that restricts the freedom of people unjustly. The fifth theme, caring for our environment, is one that people often criticise the humanist movement for overlooking. But anybody operating from a humanist worldview, I believe, is bound to find themselves needing to consider both our broader environment and other living creatures. Humanism supports the building of a better relationship between humans and the planet we live on. We fully respect and support scientific and evidence-based approaches to policy, including decisions about environmental sustainability. Our environment theme supports action to address climate change and other environmental issues that harmonise with our search for human political justice. As well, humanist ethics based on sympathy and compassion cannot help but eventually extend to all who, like us, have hopes and dreams and who can feel joy and sympathy. Our ethos of care for others will then, as I have mentioned, logically extend to all human beings. Indeed, it can extend beyond humans to all who have feelings. A humanist ethos can extend not only to all of humanity, it can extend potentially to all sentient beings. Actions under this theme will also address building better relations between humans and other living creatures. I'm going to leave more about the themes of the Human Union website to the discussion section of this presentation. I hope the Human Union website will be part of a process of building a humanist movement inspired by a humanist worldview, which becomes a place where people can join to be supported in living out their humanist values, both in daily life and political action. Now, I just want to flick this up. My main suggestion for the future is more activism around the themes I have identified in relation to the Human Union website. But I don't see the Human Union website as the be-all and end-all of humanist activism. Far from it. I see it as part of the process of the humanist movement becoming more about living out the values of a humanist worldview and less about staying in the shadow of the secularist movement. A process which, as I already mentioned, I believe has been starting to happen for several years now. In this respect, I simply advocate that humanist activism in the topics it addresses needs to be more inspired by our humanist worldview and more focused on building a better world. This does not mean abandoning the important goals of the secularist movement. As humanists, we share them, but it does mean also engaging in activism inspired by a humanist worldview. I've talked about the themes of activism, but what about the methods? It's clear that living in the digital age, we need to have a more digital focus in our activism. The Human Union website is a step in that direction, but clearly we need more effort to develop digital activism formats. It won't work, though, to simply say we need an up-to-date approach to social media. Everybody already knows that. The question is to encourage more people interested in the sort of issues I have outlined to communicate and join with us in developing better digital platforms. I see this as an interactive development where we, by broadening out our scope, we attract more people, and in attracting more people, we attract more people who are more capable of contributing to a digital profile. I'm going to finish with a request for discussion. I've been a humanist activist for many years, as Marianne mentioned, but activism is about getting people involved. You can't really have an activism project of one person or one person telling everybody else what to do. So I want to finish by asking a few questions. I want to ask people to think. Do you share with me a humanist worldview? Do you want to do something about it? If you do, the humanist movement welcomes you to be involved, and we're keen to have you involved and building your perspective and your activism profile under the umbrella of the humanist worldview that I've been talking about today. I've put up on a slide there some other issues for discussion. I think at this point, this is where I should end my presentation and thank people for listening and invite comments and questions from anybody who has something to say. I'd like to stress I'm just as happy with comments as questions. I see this not so much as I'll make a talk and everybody will go away inspired, although I'm extremely happy if everybody does go away inspired, but more like this is part of the process of building a better humanist movement. So it needs conversation and discussion and contribution from others. So I will stop sharing and invite discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lyndon.
Thanks. Thank you. Next.
Would anyone like to kick off the discussion? Les, and then Rod. And then Lisa, did I see your hand too? Yep.
Thanks, Lyndon. I think you're probably the preeminent humanist thinker in Australia today. You're really pushing the key themes, and you've been doing it for quite a while in a very eloquent way. The question I've got is around the human union piece, getting a conglomeration of nations agreeing and getting behind the notion of a human union. And my question is, with the United Nations as a global organisation since just after the Second World War, how much do you think the United Nations as an organisation and its projects has contributed to your idea of the human union, and how much more has it and we still got to do?
Thanks for the comment and the question, Les. I think I'll have to start with a little bit of history there, and apologies to everybody who already knows all this history. After World War I, we saw the first effort in human history to build a global political organisation which would achieve something like the sort of goals that I've been talking about. That was the League of Nations. It was strongly sponsored by US President Woodrow Wilson, but then he was unable to get his own treaty through the US Senate, and the League kicked off without US participation. It ran into all sorts of troubles because it couldn't get united action on a range of things, issued condemnations of various bad things, which it was unable to follow up on its condemnations. And as World War II came into existence, the League of Nations faded into insignificance. When the United Nations was started, the founders were keenly aware of the failures of the League and had to think of ways to build an organisation which wouldn't just crumble the way the League had crumbled, and an organisation which countries would be willing to join rather than unwilling to join, as the US had been after World War I. And so what they created was a real compromise, an organisation which stated the highest of ideals, possibly even more idealistic sounding than the League of Nations, but had built-in restrictions on its capacity for united action to stop it making unenforceable declarations the way the League had done. So, for instance, the 5 major powers of the day were all given the veto power in the Security Council. This was to ensure that the United Nations Security Council didn't make a declaration that wasn't going to be fully backed up by all the major powers of the day. But of course, in practice, what it means is it hardly ever makes a declaration on any major issue that is willing to enforce, because any one of the 5 major powers can stop it making that declaration. Likewise, for membership, the focus in the UN was much more on respecting the internal sovereignty of the members. The way to get everybody to join was to reduce the cost on your domestic politics of joining. So there's no question you could be a hideous totalitarian dictatorship and still be a member of the UN. You could be a wonderful, benign social welfare democracy and join the UN. And that's worked. The UN has survived and had all sorts of positive achievements where the League failed. but it's worked at a price, and the price has been the US has functioned as a medium for conversation and discussion, but it has not functioned as a medium for building a united political community. You can't be a medium for building common political values when your joining principle is that you'll fully respect the internal sovereignty of each member. If you compare that with the European Union, that's done on a very different basis, that it's not just as long as you're somewhere in Europe you can join. You have to meet human rights standards and economic and other standards and democracy standards as well before you can join. So that's created a completely different thing, a common political community with common standards across Europe. And I think that's a really important lesson for us to learn. The possibility of these two different processes was talked about and debated about at the time the United Nations was created, and the people who wanted to go heavy on democracy and human rights just lost at the time the UN was created. So with something like the Human Union, I'm proposing an actual, or not just I, but others are proposing a different process to the UN, something that I think would sit alongside it, just as the European Union sits alongside the UN and doesn't supplant it. I'm talking about supporting democracy and human rights around the world. The UN, of course, will issue declarations supporting democracy and human rights around the world, but then it'll have countries which oppose democracy and human rights on its own human rights committee. That would be an impossibility in the European Union, the way it's structured, and it would be an impossibility in the sort of human union project that I'm advocating. Does this make sense as an answer to the issue you raised?
Oh, that's an excellent answer, very thorough. Thank you very much. Very enlightening. Thank you very much, Lyndon.
We've got several people lined up for questions, and it's 11:15 already, so we might need to keep them fairly brief if we can. Rod, you had raised your hand.
Yes, thank you, and thanks, Lyndon. Terrific presentation and
Thanks.
Inspiring. Yeah, I wanted to ask about the 5 themes in Human Union, and they're all great themes. Obviously, you've put a lot of thought into what they should be, and I want to tie that back to something you said about how there's been, since the 60s and 70s when humanism was doing a lot more activism, perhaps. There's been a flourishing of single purpose or single issue groups who tend to work on those things. And I see that there are single purpose organizations and campaigning going on a lot of these. But the one that jumps out to me is the living a meaningful and fulfilling life as something that I see as a really niche humanist cause. And I wonder if you see that, or any of them, in fact, as sort of a higher priority, not a higher priority, but a more of a niche for us to work in. How do you feel about that?
Well, probably for me, I think they're all really important, and I think humanism brings something to all of them. The one you're talking about, I see that as not even a niche, but utterly fundamental. If you ask me what humanism is in a nutshell, that would be my answer. Humanism is realizing your best human potential to live a better life. So I see that as inescapable and fundamental. It's hard to talk about it in our culture because we're so unused to looking at life that way. We either have model number one, which is find meaning from outside, from religion, the nation, from a guru, from material possessions, whatever. Find meaning from outside. Or model number 2, finding meaning from inside, means hyper-individualism. Do whatever in the moment makes you feel good. Yes, yes. And humanism doesn't really represent or support either of those approaches. So it's hard to explain it briefly. And I find what's of interest to me personally is that in classical philosophy, both East and West, there's much more talk about realizing the best of our potential and how to educate and support people to live in a way which realizes their best potential. You can find a lot of this in Confucianism. You can find a chunk of it in Aristotle as well. You can find a chunk of it in Cicero's concept of humanitas, although obviously it's not just Cicero's concept. And so I often tend to think of humanism as picking back up of a tradition that was swatted to one side by religion in Western culture. So in that sense, I'm not one of those people who rush around saying everything is new, where at ground zero, it's day one, we'll create everything from afresh. I think, in fact, we have a massive cultural heritage, a really positive, strong humanist cultural heritage, which offers us a lot of resources for living a good and meaningful life today. That's not the same as saying we just parrot the ancient thinkers of the past. That won't work at all. That'd be a disaster. But we can build on that platform to build a meaningful life and good, positive, ethical relations with other people. And I actually think that's the core of humanism, and everything else flows from that. So I would say, when I talked about, maybe I better stop there because of the time.
If I can just say that what I left out before was I'm wondering if we got that right, then people would naturally want to get involved in all of the others. But I don't want to start another.
Next up, we have Melissa.
Hi. I guess my question is a bit related. The problem I find is I only have a certain number of hours to devote. And even if I could devote every working hour, I still have the problem that there are so many major serious issues. Like there's still terrible treatment of Aboriginals in this country. There's domestic violence and child abuse. There's the devastation of our climate. There's widening economic disparity and food insecurity, particularly in sort of economically less developed countries. And then there's things like youth suicide and the general alienation many people are experiencing in their lives. And I feel I've sort of scattered a little bit here, a little bit there on each of these sort of issues. And that's not very effective. So I'm looking for like underlying things that would be, that if you improve that would improve across the board. And the one that seems most immediately apparent to me is the media. That problems with things like media ownership by people like Rupert Murdoch, and problems with the spreading of the false information on the internet seem to me like the key point where if you could improve that, it would benefit all these issues. So that's my thinking, but I'm wondering what your thinking is about, given there's so many really important issues, how we can avoid dividing our focus too much.
Well, I'll try for a very quick answer on that, and I think it connects with what we've just been talking about. I don't think it's realistic for any one person to expect to be effectively acting in relation to 20 different crucial social justice projects. The question is, if we can build a strong movement and organisation, it can act in different areas on different themes. For an individual, I think the core thing is what we were just talking about with Rod, a vision of human nature which sees our better potentials and encourages us to try to cultivate them and to realise them, and encourages us to interact with other people in as socially positive a way as possible, is the foundation to the solution to lots of the problems you're talking about, especially of social isolation and alienation in the current world. And it's the foundation to seeing that solutions such as perpetual economic growth, environmental destruction, national greatness, and so on, it's the foundation to seeing that all those solutions are wrong as well. That's not the same as saying just say it and it's done, but I'm saying it can be a foundation which spreads across a lot of areas, and then we have to be realistic and expect as one individual we can't cover all those areas, but we can have this core thing in common and support others in our group who might focus on different areas. So that would be my general approach to that. I guess the other thing I'd say is, like, if it wasn't Rupert Murdoch, there's never been a period in human history where everybody is sitting around calmly, rationally, reasonably talking about things and taking the evidence into account. So I feel a person will paint themselves into a trap if they say, well, I can't do anything until we're finally in this very reasonable, rational, calm discussion society. It's highly unlikely we'll ever be there. We've never been there in the past, but that's never stopped us making progress. So I think as a humanist, I want to focus on doing the best that I can, rather than developing external, like, bogeymen or whatever and saying, I can't do anything until this external bogeyman's been put under control or something like that. So that's my general psychological approach to that, but I'll stop there.
We have a question in the chat from Emma. Wonderful presentation, Lyndon. Is there much movement on a Pacific Union?
I don't know very much about that, is my answer.
And Akiva has put his hand up. I'll let you read out your own comment, Akiva, if you wish.
I'll let the comment stand. Lyndon, terrific presentation. I guess the main question, because I put in the comment basically about enabling others, so I think you'd nod in agreement to that. The bigger question I've got is, I mean, I've been a humanist for decades, but I wouldn't say it informs my activism, because I don't see the channels, and I'm very impressed with the website, including the Human Union, but I don't see the kind of major grassroots sort of mobilization which other campaigns have. So my question for you at a thought level, and for the leadership of Humanist Humanist Australia at a kind of organizational level, is whether partnership may be the key. And I know partnership can be tricky, because you may not agree entirely with Get Up or climate activist movements. But in a way, if Humanist Australia was present as an associate of these major grassroots campaigns, would that be a step forward in your view?
Well, just in my view, I think definitely yes. I probably wouldn't use the idea of partnership as key, but I would say partnerships are an important component. We always run the risk, if we do nothing but partnership, we run the risk of what Rod was talking about before. We simply wind up piggybacking a lot of other different groups, and then people say, well, why even bother with these
Yep.
tiny little piggybacking humanist groups? So I definitely wouldn't see it as the main way to go, but clearly important, yes.
I'd like to answer Akiva's question as well. I have been very conscious of the need to reach out to other organisations in order to build our own. I reached out I discovered Tim Hollow through our campaign, the Human Union campaign on universal basic income, and I keep bumping into Tim Hollow on other campaigns. We both spoke at rallies for Bernard Collaery, for example, and obviously Tim was one of our speakers at Launchapalooza this week, and I hope to have a strong and continuing relationship with the Green Institute. I've also reached out to the Commission for the Human Future, and our next speaker is Dr. Anna-Greta Hunter, chair of the Commission. And I would like to keep reaching out to more and more groups. Humanist Australia does have a formal mechanism for recognising other organisations as either affiliates or allies. The key difference between those two relationships is that an affiliate is a group which thinks of itself as being humanist. Their leaders are humanists, and their leaders have joined Humanists Australia. So that will encompass things like Humanists Victoria and potentially other humanist groups around the country. Allies are groups where we have common interests, but the leadership are not necessarily humanists. Sue has put her hand up for a question.
Probably a lesser question, just following on from what Marianne was saying, because I guess for me, there's a sense that Humanist Australia will become a kind of a way of bringing humanists together across Australia, but also act as a kind of a resource portal gateway, if you like, into various sort of activism, so that people who it's a one place where we can find out about those organisations that share humanist values and how we might get involved as individuals in terms of particular passions. Some people are really, really passionate about the environmental issues. Some are really passionate about each one of those things that Melissa was talking about. And no one of us can cover everything, but we can actually perhaps use the support of Humanist Australia to become involved in particular things that drive our particular passion and our desire to be active in that particular arena. And certainly having organisations that do share those humanist values or identify as humanist as well would be a great way of supporting and assisting humanists to identify those sorts of avenues, I think. Thank you.
Jenny has asked, should we be being active on the question of economic measures, such as using the GPI, Genuine Progress Indicator, instead of GDP? I'll take that question if I may, Lyndon.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
We actually do have a planned campaign for Human Union with the hashtag #CountWhatMatters on the topic of using better indicators for GDP. So Human Union is maintaining a list of potential campaigns on a Trello board, and it's a matter of prioritising the campaigns and getting them onto the website. If you have ideas for campaigns, please get in touch with Lyndon or David or Ian or myself. We're the main team looking after the Human Union website, and we'll work with you to help get those campaigns up and running, as long as they fit in with one of the 5 themes. It's past 11. I think we need to wrap that up for now. Thank you again so much, Lyndon. We really appreciate your coming here and talking to us today.
Thanks very much. I've really enjoyed the whole session and conversation. So thank you.
So please, everyone, put your hands together for Lyndon.
Thanks. Thank you.
Activism Day continues with lunch from 12:30, which is a chance for a casual chat with fellow humanists over a meal in this same Zoom room. After lunch, the final session of Launchapalooza, featuring Dr. Anna-Greta Hunter from the Commission for the Human Future, will begin at 2 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time. I hope to see you there.